Albion live among various forms of chaos and as such spend most of their time defending their lands from all kinds of invaders. To do this, they have a roster packed with high defense and damage to hold back the chaotic tide and chop them down to size. But how does this roster work in battles? Let's take a look and find out. Right after a word from channel partner Instant Gaming. If you want games and you want them cheap, you should check them out. Little hack for you, if you grab their extension, you can see what discounts they have on the very game you're watching YouTube videos on, like Warhammer 3 for example, for 70% off. It works on YouTube and even Steam, so you can make sure you're getting the very best deal possible. Head on down to the link in the description to check out Instant Gaming for yourself and grab some cheap games risk-free with their 24/7 customer service. Now, back to the video. First up we have the Lords, starting with the legendary Lord Marinian, the Murder Queen. She's a decent early battler with okay melee stats but lower non-armor piercing damage. She does have magical attacks, so will do well versus anything relying on resistance, but her overall damage is quite low alongside her toughness, so I wouldn't get her fighting against anything that's tough or deals damage of its own. Instead, focus on leveling up her spellbook to bring the army value from there. She has a nice mix of beasts, death, and shadows, so always has a cast for any occasion. She also has one mounting option. Oidch? That's hard to say, man. This grants her flight and obviously a lot of speed. Other than that, it doesn't really change how you want to use her all that much. Now sure, she has a little more damage, but still no real armor piercing or toughness, so the most she can do is take on enemy backlines infantry, and even then, I'd send her in with support so she doesn't get overwhelmed and surrounded. Use that high speed to get spells wherever needed, and treat actual combat as secondary to casting and staying alive. Our other legendary lord is Dural Durak, and honestly he's more or less the same story as Marinian, slightly worse across the board, so really wants to avoid any and all combat if at all possible. He has the Law of the Truthsayers, which has some pretty strong buffs to support his army, so get him doing that from the safety of the backlines and leave combat over units. He also has a couple of mounting options. Warhorse gives him more speed and charge, but he can still be used the exact same, just use that extra mobility to get spells off whenever needed. And the Albion Chariot. Now it can be used for actual combat, but only if you can handle the micro of chariots. He'll need constant orders to move in and out of enemies, or he'll simply get pinned down and taken apart in moments. If you can handle that, then go right ahead. Otherwise, stick to the horse for the added speed for support casting. Next up, we have the first generic lord, the Overking. These are some pretty basic combat lords. They have some decent melee stats for both attack and defense, and combined with their armor and shield, they're extremely tanky to most forms of damage. However, their own damage is just a little bit lacking. It's not bad, but it's not very armor piercing either, making them just a little bit useless as the game goes on and the front lines become tankier. The best use for them is of course the front lines, just trying to focus on the less armored targets to ensure their damage is actually felt, and try not to let them get totally surrounded. For their mounting options, they have the Albion Warhorse. This grants them more speed and charge bonus alongside the larger hitbox. This makes them pretty good at taking on back lines and a little worse on the front lines due to them being a lot easier to pin down. We also have the Albion Chariot. And lastly, we have our Truthsayer Lords. These come with the Law of Truthsayers, Light, Life, or Beasts. These are very basic spellcasters with no real combat prowess outside of this. Low melee stats, low damage, and low toughness. Just keep them well back and casting to support your army, or staying out of any and all combat, and they should do just fine. And they come with an Albion Warhorse mount. Kicking off the heroes, we have the Petty Chieftains. These are another combat character, but these actually have quite a bit of armor piercing damage. Their melee stats sure lean more on the defense than the attack, but with armor piercing and bonus versus large, they'll hit extremely hard whenever they do manage to land one. Even with that high defense, they're still a little bit vulnerable with lower armor and no shield. Use them to take on more elite targets like lords and heroes, just keep an eye on them taking too many hits and pull them out for healing if needed. For their mounting options, they have the Albion Warhorse and the Albion Chariot. Our other heroes are the Druidic Priestesses. These are another basic spellcaster with no real use outside of that. They have a weird mix of beasts, life, light, and truthsayers, giving them a very support-heavy focus, so keep them on the back lines, supporting your troops, and they should do just fine. They also come with a Warhorse mount. Now we come to the melee infantry. First up, we have the Warband. These are a very basic front lines unit with a little more focus on damage than defense. Their melee stats are actually very respectable for such an early game unit, making them scale fairly well throughout the entire game. Their damage is also half decent as long as you're not going up against anything with armor. I'd still try to support them as much as possible with anything you can, especially as the low defense can make them just a little bit quick to die. You want to make sure these guys, as well as most of their roster, are winning combat whenever possible. Their War Fury bolsters their combat leadership whenever they're confident, but as soon as they feel they're losing combat, they'll rapidly lose leadership, resulting in a quick break in army if you aren't too careful. You also want to be careful when casting spells, as dropping below 15 winds of magic will mean most of your army will miss out on 8% damage resistance, which can really make a difference, especially on those less armored units. The Spears Warband lose shields but are otherwise much more defensive focused. They drop a lot of attack and a little bit of damage to gain a good chunk of defense, anti-large bonus and charge defense, making them a lot harder to get rid of without missiles. Of course, give them support against any ranged troops to keep them safe, and bring in plenty of damage to take out whatever they're holding in place. We also have the Great Weapons Warband. These drop even more defense than the base form to gain some attack and armor piercing damage. This of course makes them into some very powerful early game damage dealers, whilst also being extremely vulnerable to all forms of damage. If you choose these, be prepared to be replenishing and replacing on the regular. In my opinion, spears are the way to go since you'll need to support them no matter what, and you might as well have a healthy army that's easy to manage and keep alive. Next up we have Woad Raiders. These are some real early game damage dealers. Their attack combined with the high anti-infantry damage makes them experts at chewing through tides of chaff in moments. Sadly, their low defense and zero armor makes them the littlest bit vulnerable to any and all damage that comes back to them. Even with their 25% physical resistance, they will die very quickly if they're against anything with any real damage. I wouldn't rely on these as an entire front lines, but a couple of them spread out to target weak units will do just fine to thin the herd and get you a numbers advantage as fast as possible. Just keep an eye on the armor of whatever they're fighting and give them some help if they need it. Druidic Initiates are a very strange unit. They have okay melee stats, decent non-armor piercing magical damage, and very low armor. This makes them into a frontline that I can't really ever recommend since they simply don't do enough. However, the fact that they come with 2 banned spells makes them something that I would say bringing a couple of wouldn't be such a terrible idea. A full line of them would be pretty weak, but 1 or 2 of them mixed into your front lines will be a great addition for some great extra damage and support. They are a bit of a gimmick unit, but it's a fairly cool gimmick, so I'm not complaining. The Oathsworn are a bit more of a return back to normal. They're a very strong defensive unit and come with everything you'd expect. Solid melee stats with an emphasis on defense, high armor and a shield, and some halfway decent damage, but not too much armor piercing. They'll do great as a solid line of troops that can hold back enemies and allow your other units to come in and deal all the real damage. Not much more to say than that. Simple and strong, so no real complaints here. We also have the Halberds Oathsworn. These drop attack and shields to gain even more defense, some armor piercing anti-large, and some charge defense. Honestly, both variants are really strong in their own ways. If you're going against a lot of ranged, then the shields will be the way to go. Otherwise, the Halberds with their great defense and a little bit of damage. Either way, you'll be supporting them with whatever you can, so the way to use them hardly changes. If you opt for these guys, just be careful to clear out ranged troops, otherwise they can still go down fast. The Maiden Guard are another strange one. They have lower melee stats for such a late game infantry unit. That said, they do come with some very respectable magical, armor piercing and anti-large damage, so once they hit combat and land some strikes, they'll start to deal some halfway decent damage in no time. Sadly, they'll also likely take a ton of damage themselves due to their lower defense stats, lack of shields, low armor, and only 25% physical resistance. I'd say they'll be better used as a support infantry unit that aids your front lines instead of replacing them. With their high speed, they should be able to get off flanks no problem. Just keep an eye out for enemy cav catching them en route. Honestly, they're a little bit niche and possibly too niche to use regularly, but they can do their very specific job pretty well, so it's not all bad. Highlanders are another question mark unit. I know what they're meant to be good at. They deal great armor piercing anti-infantry damage, so are meant to be late game infantry munchers. The only problem is their lower melee stats, including pathetic defense and medium armor for a late game unit. They may well shred infantry once they hit the front lines, but they'll also likely die in the process. Now, thanks to their freedom ability, they'll be unable to lose entities upon entering combat and every 30 seconds after that, but that's just entities. They'll still drop in HP in a matter of moments, and in my opinion are just not worth the risk. Even if you do use them, they'll need lots and lots of help, just like halberds, which can also keep themselves alive, so in my opinion, just stick to those and leave these in the recruitment screen. Lastly, we have the Chosen of Ishanos. On the other hand, these are well worth bringing despite a number of downsides. Good stuff first. Moderate armor, but still higher than Highlanders. Great melee stats, including a brilliant 60 defense, makes them extremely tanky against anything up close. Excellent armor piercing damage, so they can dish it out just as much as they can take it. And lastly, regeneration, meaning each bit of damage they take, they'll automatically start gaining it back as long as their leadership doesn't break. Now, the downsides are mainly the fact that they're elementals, so once their leadership drops, they'll fall to pieces and die in seconds, but with their stats, this is very unlikely to happen very quickly. They're great endgame frontline units that will hold back just about anything and deal some great damage whilst they're there. I'd still throw support at them to clear front lines fast, but even alone, they'll get the job done against almost anything. Now we come to the ranged infantry. First up, the Young Slingers. These are a pretty basic early game ranged unit. Medium range, medium damage, and useless melee stats. What more would you expect? They'll do decently well early on and provide some nice support damage for your front lines and focus down key targets pretty well. Just get them set up with a good view of the battle and let them get to work. Their firing arc isn't flat, but it isn't the most arced either, so getting them any angle you can will vastly increase their chances of landing safe shots. Just keep them out of melee at all times and firing as much as you can, and they should do just fine. We also have the Huntresses. These have the same damage but a little more range and ammo. Alongside this, they have the ability to be a lot sneakier with their Stalk and Vanguard deployments, alongside skirmishing ability with their firing on the move. However, the best way you can use them is the exact same as Slingers. They don't have the speed to skirmish or the melee stats to defend themselves in a flank gone wrong. You can try to use them for these jobs, but by far the safest and easiest way to use them is like a normal ranged unit, safe and sound on your backlines and focus firing anything that's a major threat. Damage isn't the best once armor gets higher, but with enough focus fire, they can take down anything, so just keep an eye on them for the occasional bits of target prioritization. Now we come to the Cav. First up, Hoblars. These are a very standard early game Cav unit, and that means high speed, lower melee stats, and a little bit of charge and damage. They're not bad by any means, and in the very early game, they will do just fine at taking out enemy ranged and some light charging into the backs of the front lines. But really, you want to replace them as soon as possible, as their survivability is pretty poor. That damage combined with their defense will spell a quick doom for them if they get caught fighting anything that isn't very weak ranged units. Use their very high speed to flank enemy front lines and dismantle their backline with cycle charging if you're good at micro, or some sustained combat if you can handle the replenishment later. Once that's done, charge the backs of the front lines and keep them on the move to stay alive. We also have Spears Hoblars. These drop some defense and weapon strength to gain a bonus versus large and some charge bonus. It's not really enough to change how they work, just lean on the charge a little bit more and be extra cautious of leaving them in combat against anything. Don't be fooled by the anti-large damage and think they can hunt down enemy cav or monsters. If you can charge some larger targets on the front lines, then great. Otherwise, stick to the same game plan as before, just now enjoy a little bit more sauce on that initial charge. Next up, the Oath Swarm Cavalry, and these are pretty much a direct upgrade from the Hoblars. They lose some speed but are gaining essentially everything else. The charge bonus stays the same, but the melee attack and damage see a nice bump alongside a lot more armor. This makes them extremely powerful at taking on enemy backlines risk-free. The non-armor piercing damage and improved melee stats will do just fine against most ranged infantry, and charging the front lines can be done with a little less risk and a little more damage. The game plan is still just the same, only they're a little bit slower and a lot harder to kill. They also come with spears. Similar to before, they drop some melee stats and damage to gain anti-large bonus and a lot of charge bonus. This makes them far better at cycle charging and a little worse in sustained combat. It shouldn't really make too much of a difference when taking on backlines, but when it comes to charge the front lines, you'll see a nice boost to their damage as long as you can keep them cycling in and out of combat. Again, don't send them chasing monsters or other cav, as the drop in melee stats does make them a lot easier to take out against anything that can fight. Simply cycle charge anything large you see in the front lines for a nice boost to their damage. The War Chariots are slower than the cavalry and drop quite a lot of melee stats to gain a ton of charge and some armor-piercing anti-infantry damage. Their devastating charge only makes all of this better with the improved mass and speed, making them into real charging powerhouses. As usual with chariots, you need to keep them on the move at all times, weaving in and out of enemy lines to rack up a ton of damage from constant charging. If they get bogged down and stuck in sustained melee, they can go down in moments, so constant movement is a must. Their high mass allows them to pull through enemy lines pretty well, and they can deal massive amounts of damage if you can stay on top of the micro. If you can handle it, then they're a great addition and blow any value you can get from other cav out of the water. But if you can't, then stick to regular cav and you should have a much easier time at things. Next up, Centaurs. These come from the Beastmen, so are a little bit out of place in this roster. They're very similar to the Oath Sworn Cav with identical melee stats, but a little more charge bonus and armor-piercing damage. However, the drop in armor and leadership tends to make them a little bit risky to use. Still, the way to use them is pretty much the same as everyone else. Take out backlines first, which should go down a lot faster with their increased damage and charge, then charge the backlines, which again should deal a lot more damage but also be a lot more risky with their lack of armor. I'd say they are better as long as you use them right, so just make sure you stay on top of them and you should be fine. We also have a single missile cavalry unit, the Javelin Hoblars. These are pretty much what you'd expect. Same speed as the regular Hoblars, much less melee power, and some range damage. It's nothing crazy with shorter range and lower ammo, but overall some decent non-armor piercing damage that they can safely deal to pretty much anything with that very high speed. Either have them play up at the start of battles to pick enemies apart on the approach, or have them flank once the lines have clashed to fire into the backs of the front lines in moments. Whatever you do, keep them far away from any and/or melee and make use of that skirmishing command to keep them safe. If they get caught in melee with anything, they will go down fast, so just keep them firing until they run out of ammo, then get them chasing down retreating units to contribute without much risk to themselves. Now we come to the monsters and beasts. First up, the Bloodhounds. If you've used any of the other Warhound units in game before, then these will seem very familiar. They function basically the same, so are extremely fast but very squishy beasties who excel at taking out weaker backlines ranged units, but their absolute speciality is retreating units. Once something is on the run, send in these guys to make sure it doesn't come back. I'd avoid having them engage against anything that can actually fight, as their melee stats are just too poor to engage anything halfway decent, and they'll die or run in seconds, especially with that extremely low leadership. In the early game, they'll do some great work and easily win you battles as long as you can pick them the right targets. The Ithich Giant Blooded are some pretty straightforward frontlines monsters. They're not the toughest units in the world, so using the classic strategy of sending them in alongside your front lines will be the way to go to ensure they can deal damage, whilst also staying relatively safe. Speaking of damage, theirs is pretty damn strong, especially for an early unit. While it doesn't display the armor-piercing symbol, they'll do great versus anything the early or mid-game can throw at them, and chew through just about any defenses you put in front of them. With their high speed and charge bonus, they'll hit the front lines hard and devastate anything they find in their way. Just be cautious of them getting surrounded or focused from a range, and they should be just fine. The Feral Griffin is another slightly strange unit with some odd stats to say the least. Okay melee stats with very good defense for a larger target. Great damage with armor piercing and a bonus versus large. Then, very low armor and some medium charge bonus. I would say stick it in the front lines, targeting large targets is probably the easiest way to use it. You want to be very careful to keep it nearby to allied units, as it's a single entity and very easy to surround if you aren't careful, spelling a quick doom. The damage is really great and can chew through anything it finds itself attacking. Just be extremely cautious of enemy range, as they can very quickly tear it to pieces with that lower armor. If you wanted to be super safe, you could use it as a flying charge unit, cycling in and out of combat, but this would be very micro-intensive and difficult to pull off reliably, so only do this if you're sure that you can handle it. Otherwise, stick to the front lines. Fen Beasts are another front lines monster, seeing some improvements across the board, making them better at the exact same job as Eye features. Stick them in the front lines alongside your infantry and watch them get to work with their high armor piercing damage and decent melee stats. Now also enjoy them being a lot harder to get rid of, with high defense, a little more armor, and some regeneration. They're also a construct unit, so once their leadership gets low, they'll start to fall to pieces, so make sure to keep them confident with nearby allies, spells, and maintaining high levels of Winds of Magic to fuel their magic dependence. As usual, look out for ranged focus or surrounding them in melee, and they should be fine. Next we have the Albion Giants, another giant unit, and just like the rest of them, it's a bit of a pincushion for enemy range, so taking them out before it approaches will be essential for their success. If the path is clear and they can make it to the front lines unscathed, they can deal some outstanding damage to anything they find. Their massive armor-piercing weapon strength combined with their huge melee attack makes them devastating versus infantry and monsters alike, especially in a small area. Their defense isn't the highest, but with their huge HP bar, moderate armor, physical resistance, and woad paint, it all actually makes them somewhat tanky. I can't stress enough how useless giants are if you don't get rid of ranged, so just make sure you do, and you should have a great time. The Zoes are direct from the Wood Elves, so I don't really want to spend too much time on them. They're really strong melee monsters with great melee stats, damage, and speed, making them extremely versatile in what they can attack. They can embed in front lines, flank around to attack ranged troops, or hunt enemy cav. The only wrong way to use them is to not use them, so just get some in your armies and go wild. Their bound spells also bring a ton of healing and buffing value, so you really can't go wrong. The Stone Thrower Giant is pretty much a Cygor from the Beastmen and functions basically the same. He has extremely long-range armor-piercing anti-infantry missiles that deal devastating damage to clumps of enemies. It can also do great work in melee with very high damage and some passable melee stats. Focus on keeping it on the back lines and using up all the ammo before thinking about sending it in for melee, and choose priority targets to maximize your value and reduce friendly fire as much as possible. The Fen Hulks are pretty much a larger single-entity Fen Beast. It's not quite as large as the Giants, making it a little easier to keep alive under enemy fire, but I'd still advise clearing them out as much as possible before bringing in these lads, just to be safe. Once they hit melee, they'll do some great damage with very strong melee stats and great armor-piercing damage. Their embodiment of Albion traits also makes them nearly impossible to escape from, with their massive speed reduction and passive increases to Winds of Magic recharge rate makes them invaluable in any army. The only downside is a low leadership and constructness, making them fall to pieces if they lose confidence. Keep them happy with nearby allies, spells, and abilities, and you should have a great time. Next we have the Ogham Barrow Knights. These are a very strong front lines unit similar to the Graveguard. They can only be recruited from the Great Ogham Circle landmark located in Concarta. They have great armor, decent melee stats, and some fairly strong anti-infantry damage. The real downside is a lack of armor piercing, but they can easily bring in some monsters to help with that. They're a decent alternative to Oathsworn if you have them available, just be aware of their undead traits as they will fall to pieces once their leadership drops, and you don't really have many ways to keep them alive outside of the lore of vampires, so it can be quite a risk. We also have Crows. These are like Fellbats if they were somehow worse. They have excellent speed from their flight, grant a ton of vision of the battlefield, and actually have halfway decent defense. However, that is where the good times end. Their attack and damage is non-existent, their actual tankiness is pathetic with no armor and low HP. All they're really good for is holding enemy units still while something else is en route to actually take them out. They can cluster around targets to stop them from doing anything else, but the chances of these things getting a kill is basically nothing. Stick with Bloodhounds for a unit that actually does something. Ravens are a big step up in everything but defense, which actually takes a small hit. They're now real units that can do something in battle, like taking out flying units or blitz attacking backlines to take out missile troops in seconds. Use their high speed and flight to get around enemy armies and dismantle their ranged troops before they can do anything about it. Take out weaker hostile flyers and generally cause chaos wherever you can. They're still not tough enough to be on the front lines all by themselves, but once backlines and flyers are taken care of, by all means, bring them in to attack from the rear for a quick shatter. Lastly, we have the one and only artillery unit, the Lonog Catapult. It's the one and only artillery unit, and sad to say, it kinda sucks. For some reason, I could just not get this thing to fire once the lines clashed, no matter what angle I got it. It seems to have a very flat firing arc for a catapult, making it very hard to use outside of the starting moments of battles. If you can get them shooting, then clumps of infantry are the way to go with the armor-piercing damage in a decent sized area. The range is actually pretty great too. Just be aware that firing at max range gives the enemy plenty of time to move out of the way, so aim for the biggest clumps you can to give yourself the best chance of landing hits. And of course, keep them out of any and all melee, as they will die to pretty much anything. We also have the Regiments of Renown. We have the Warriors of Choitek, who are a warband unit, and lose the downside of War Fury and gain fire resistance. The Bloodsworn are Woad Raiders, and lose the downside of War Fury and become unbreakable and gain a barrier. The Oracle's Maiden Guard are Maiden Guard, and lose devastating charge to gain Guardian, expert charge defense, and immunity to psychology. The Defenders of Khan Malog are a Highlanders unit and gain the Pikes of Khan Malog ability and expert charge defense. The Wardens of the Isle are a Huntress unit and lose the downside of War Fury to gain charge defense versus large. The Firstborn Sons are an Oathsworn Cavalry unit and gain devastating charge and something to prove. The Hunters of the Plains of Battle are a Centaurs unit and gain Rowdy and the ability to deal ranged damage. Catch Tor is a Stonethrower Giant and gains the Hengist Blessing ability. The Green Man is a Fen Hulk and gains Awakening of the Wood and Shield of Thorns as bound spells and the Fear the Green Man ability. And finally, Bollogs is an Albion Giant and gains the Bollogs ability, Henger's Blessing, and the Greatest Champion of Albion. Albion also comes with its unique Law of Magic, the Law of the Truthsayers. The spell passive is the Mist of Albion, and it grants all allies on the map 20% missile resistance for 15 seconds. It's pretty nice, and 15 seconds is long enough to absorb a barrage or two. As with all passives, I wouldn't focus on it when timing your spells, but if you're against a ranged heavy army, it'll get you some extra value as long as they're firing at the time of casting. Blessing of Valor is best used on high damage units that aren't against armor. The weapon damage only boosts the existing damage split, so no real armor piercing benefit unless the target unit already has some. It's also great for using on targets fighting enemies with physical resistance. Ranged units can also be good, but honestly the faction doesn't really have any that I'd want to use it on more than something in melee, so I won't bother. The Overcast is well worth using on groups of frontlines units with existing high damage to push them to new highs. Extra base and armor piercing alongside magical damage means basically nothing can stand up to this. The Wings of Fate is really strong versus clumps of enemies. Just get your caster an angle and let them fly for some nice area damage. There's really not much more to it than that. It's good damage and quite cheap. Win-win. The Overcast just does more damage both with more missiles and per missile. If you want more damage and have the wins to spare, then by all means go for it, as this really does a ton of damage for such a seemingly basic spell. Boon of Courage is a little harder to use than most. The leadership is useful for keeping units. The leadership is useful on units losing confidence, especially those constructs and elementals in the roster. If you can stop them from crumbling with this, then by all means use it to keep them alive. It probably won't see as much use as the other effects, but it can really come in useful when you need them. As for the Overcast, if you have multiple units that are about to break, use this. Not much else to say since the effects are the same, it's just now in an area. The Shield of the Ancestors is a huge amount of damage resistance, almost cutting in half all damage that comes towards a target. It's honestly hard to justify using this on something, but generally, if a unit is getting a lot of focus and dying fast, use this to slow the damage and either give them time to deal with the threat or get out of whatever mess they find themselves in. With 30 seconds, they have a lot of time to think about it. Just make sure no matter what choice they make, they actually do something. Last thing you want is just delaying their death, only for them to get no more value anyway. The Overcast, if you need to drop the damage on multiple units, then use the Overcast. Honestly, it's extremely cheap for just how much damage you can stop, so feel free to drop this anytime you have a cluster of units taking too much fire. Hell, just throw it in your front lines and watch your units absorb damage and destroy whatever's in their path. Just like the base cast, make sure the extra toughness is used and you'll be fine. The Gift of Life is pretty self-explanatory. If units have taken damage and you want them to be healthy again, use this. The only time it's a really bad idea is on units that are basically dead already, shattered, or fighting against fire damage. Any other time it's fair game and will bring you a lot of value. It's also useful for using after battles have been decided but not ended, so you can heal up your army as much as possible before heading to the campaign map. A little bit boring and cheesy, but it gets the job done. The Overcast, if you have units that need healing in an area, then use this. Nothing else to say since it's just the exact same as before. And lastly, Voice of Command. This is really useful for focus firing enemy units. Draw them out into the open, use this spell and retreat all other units before targeting them with all the ranged power you've got, like that one scene in The Last Jedi. There's not really a bad target, just pick something threatening and go for it. Single entities tend to work better since they're easy to really focus fire and can't do any weird animations where they technically ignore movement prevention like infantry can. As for the Overcast, if there's multiple targets in an area you want to take down, then use this. It is a little expensive, but it will keep enemies still for a significant period of time and allow you to throw everything you've got at them in the meantime. Honestly, the faction doesn't have the firepower to make full use of this, so just do your best to take out the biggest threats first. Now we come to the army comps for tier 1, 2 and beyond. Starting with tier 1, we have a Truthsayer Lord. These are going to start out very weak, but once they get some spells online, they're the best generic choice to lead your armies, as the other kings just never really get all that good. Keep them well back and supporting with spells and avoid combat at all times. For the front lines, we're going with 6 Spear Warband. These will be your front lines, so move up and engage the enemies and hold them back for as long as possible whilst waiting for the damage to come from the rest of your units. Speaking of which, 6 Young Slingers will be a lot of the early game damage. They can focus fire key tags to take them down fast, or simply pepper the front lines if nothing is a particularly large threat. Just keep them out of trouble and focus fire anything moving to threaten them, as losing them can very quickly mean losing the fight. I'm going to go with 3 Hoplars. These are going to focus the enemy backlines if possible and take out any ranged threats to give your army a clear approach. If there are no ranged threats, then charging the rear of the front lines to break them as soon as possible will be their main task, as long as you can stay on top of their micro. And lastly, 4 Bloodhounds. These are going to aid with the backlines and finish off anything that retreats to get you to army losses as quickly as possible. At tier 2, our Truthsayers should have a few more spells online and a Warhorse mount, so have no problem providing spell support wherever needed, whilst avoiding any and all combat. We're also going to pick up a Petty Chieftain. These will provide some much needed dueling ability for your army and be able to take on most hostile lords and heroes, no problem. They're also great on the front lines in general, so as long as they're battling something, they're probably doing well. For the front lines, going with 6 Halberd Oathsworn, these will take the job of the Warband, only now be a lot better at it. Great defense to hold units back for a very long time, decent damage to chip away whatever comes at them. What more could you ask for? Just make sure you clear out any ranged units, as a lack of shields does make them a touch vulnerable on the approach. We're going to go with 6 Huntresses. These will provide a great deal of damage despite their meager missile strength stats. Use focus firing to burst down major threats as quickly as possible and keep them out of melee as much as you can to maintain a high damage output. Once lines clash and if the flanks are safe to do so, they can move around for an angle, but you'll have to decide if this is safe to do so for yourself. We're going to go with 4 Aethege Giant Blooded. These are going to bring a ton of damage to the front lines and help your troops push through whatever you put in front of them. Again, they're weak to range, so make sure they're all cleared out before these guys move in, otherwise they'll go down fast. Lastly, we're going to go with 2 Oathsworn Cavalry. These are inheriting the backline's harassment job from the last Cav unit. With just 2, you might feel overwhelmed, but they should chew through their targets a lot faster. Just be sure to keep up with them to provide regular orders and keep them moving and attacking something. Once backlines are clear, move them around to charge the front lines for even more value. Lastly, for our tier 3 army, we have the Truthsayer, just the same as before. The Petty Chieftain can now be on a mount of their choice. I personally went for the horse as it's a lot easier to manage, so they'll be great at the same job as before, just a little bit larger and a lot faster. The endgame front line is going with 6 Ishanos Chosen, and these are a huge step up. Still great defensive line holders, now with a bunch of damage and regen. Just the same as before, move them up to engage and hold enemies in place before bringing in other troops to do the real damage. I dropped down to 4 Huntresses. I debated whether to get rid of these completely, but even with their low damage, they still bring a lot of value with their focus fire capabilities that monsters can't really replicate. Save them for those key targets as their damage won't really punch through anything else without it. I'm going to go with 4 Zotes. These will replace the Cav and be able to take on backlines threats, hunt down enemy Cav, or just aid the front lines. Wherever they're needed, they'll do a great job. We're going to go with 2 Stone Thrower Giants. These will work as artillery in the back, targeting large clumps of enemies, large and small, for massive damage. They may not one-shot anything, but over the course of the game, they add up to getting a ton of value with very minimal risk. And finally, 2 Fen Hulks. These are going to bring a lot more power to the front lines. If the Zotes are busy, these will provide plenty of damage and presence and take on just about anything with relative ease. Just keep enemy ranged at bay, and it should be smooth sailing. Lastly, let's wrap up with a few closing thoughts about the roster side of the Albion mod. As usual with OVN, everything here feels very cohesive as far as theming goes. Nothing really sticks out as a unit that doesn't belong, and whilst there are a couple of ports from other factions, the roster does feel unique enough that you won't confuse them with anyone else. Balance is also pretty strong with them definitely not feeling overpowered. In fact, if anything, I'd say the roster is a little bit on the weaker side, but not in a significant way that makes them less fun to play. It's mainly their ranged options which make them feel a little less strong. Their main power is their front lines and monsters, with not a lot of strong ranged units. Ranged are generally the strongest and easiest units to use, so them lacking them just makes them seem weaker by default. That said, if you play to their strengths and build armies right, you can absolutely beat ranged focused armies, no problem. Their unique lore is another fun addition and very much feels totally bespoke for the faction. There's a great mix of spells for damage, utility and even regeneration, making it usable in pretty much any situation. I don't really have a lot of complaints. They have a couple of Lord and Hero choices for leadership variety, lots of strong units for the full duration of the game, and even room for a couple of niche choices if you wanted to try something different. If you're tired of roaming the Chaos Wastes as one of the 30 different chaotic factions you can play as up there, and instead want to take them on with some slightly more good guys, these are a great pick to do so and feel very suited for that job. But that's everything I have on the roster of the OVN Albion mod. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the roster, support the channel to see yourself in the credits, like, subscribe, and if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos, then why not check out this one all about the campaign side of Albion.